Those who know me personally might know I've been a big football fan since I was a kid. But among all the beautiful moments, the atmosphere in the stadiums can get really heated sometimes. And on one occasion, tensions boiled over to the people on the very top of government. Welcome to the second episode of Wacky Wars, where I cover all the weird, short and pointless wars in human history. Today I'll talk about the war between Honduras and El Salvador, known as the Football War. But first, let's rewind a bit. In the mid-1960s, El Salvador started dealing with an overpopulation crisis. In 1964, the country's population totaled just over 3 million people, while having an area of just 21,041 square kilometers. Meanwhile, neighboring Honduras had almost 1 million less people living there, despite being more than 5 times larger. So, to combat the crisis, the Salvadoran farmers started moving to Honduras in search of land, most of which was not used, and therefore free to settle. And by 1969, more than 300,000 Salvadorans were living in Honduras. The Honduran government wasn't very keen on this, but there was one organization in particular who saw these new settlers as a threat: the United Fruit Company. Now, there's something you have to understand about Honduras and Latin America as a whole in these decades. Many of these countries were so-called banana republics, meaning their economy was dependent on exploiting natural resources, in this case bananas, by mostly American companies. In Guatemala in 1954 there was a military coup d'etat supported and organized by the US, which was heavily lobbied by the UFCO. In Honduras, UFCO owned 10% of arable land, and in 1966 it helped to form the National Federation of Farmers and Livestock Farmers of Honduras, or FENAH for short. And they quickly started putting pressure on the president, Oswaldo López Arellano, to take action. And take action he did. In 1967 he enforced a new land reform law which gave much of the land occupied by Salvadoran immigrants to the central government, who then redistributed that land to native Hondurans. The immigrants had no choice but to come back to El Salvador. And then came 1969. The 1970 FIFA World Cup was due to be held in Mexico, and both Honduras and El Salvador were among the 12 CONCACAF teams to enter the fight for one spot in the final tournament. In the first round, both teams won their groups, with Honduras beating Costa Rica and Jamaica, while El Salvador kicked out Suriname and Netherlands Antilles. With 4 teams remaining, it was time for two-legged semifinals. In the first semifinal, Haiti surprisingly knocked out the US, beating them 2-0 at home and 1-0 away. That meant that the second semifinal would be between Honduras and El Salvador. The first match took place in Honduras, with the hosts winning 1-0. For the rematch in El Salvador, the Honduran team wasn't welcomed with open arms. In fact, after the game, which El Salvador won 3-0, the Honduran team fled home in a bulletproof bus. Because back in the good old days, the scores didn't matter, there had to be a third game held on June 27th on neutral ground. The game went into extra time, with El Salvador eventually winning 3-2, knocking Honduras out. That same day, El Salvador severed all diplomatic relations with Honduras, and on July 14th, the invasion began. Salvadoran Air Force quickly began targeting strategic locations within Honduras, most importantly the Toncontin International Airport, which was a massive blow for Honduras. Later the same day, the ground invasion began, with the 30,000 men strong Salvadoran army pushing north and advancing as far as a few dozen kilometers south of Tegucigalpa. The Honduran army was smaller, having 23,000 men mobilized, with Nicaragua supplying them with weapons and ammunition. On July 16th, the Honduran Air Force finally got their act together and began airstrikes on Salvadoran territory. They targeted the Ilopango airport and the Salvadoran oil reserves stored in Acajutla. In response, El Salvador started firing anti-air defense missiles, which brought down some of the bombers. With further aid coming from Nicaragua and air superiority becoming contested, the Salvadoran advance was halted. However, the troops were still within striking distance of Tegucigalpa, and so Honduras pressured the Organization of American States to intervene. On July 18th, the OAS called on an immediate ceasefire, which was signed later that day and came into effect on July 20th. It took more than 2 weeks for El Salvador to remove their troops from Honduran territory. They resisted the pressure of OAS, calling for reparations and improved treatment of immigrants, but after the threat of sanctions was brought up, Salvadoran troops were brought home on August 2nd. El Salvador suffered 900 casualties, most of them civilians in Honduran airstrikes. Honduras, meanwhile, suffered around 2,100 casualties, only a fraction of that number being military losses. The conflict left more than 300,000 Salvadorans displaced, either exiled from Honduras or fleeing from the conflict. And the Salvadoran government didn't really welcome them with open arms, and as years went by, these tensions would boil over into a full-blown civil war in the country. As for the football, El Salvador still had Haiti to play in the deciding fixture. It took 3 games again, but El Salvador came out victorious and went to play in their first ever World Cup, only to lose to Mexico, USSR and Belgium, scoring 0 points and not qualifying from the group stage. And just when I thought there would be a happy ending to this story. Well, cue the music, I guess.
El Salvador.